So I'm not a researcher, but I deal with researchers. We also have Ed Gerstner from Nature Research, Kat Williams from Altmetric, Tiago Barros from F1000, and Mimi Kashani from Figshare. So I'm going to kick off with a few comments of my own. So Noah this morning talked about the history of peer review, so he said most of what I was planning to say, but I'll say it all again anyway. So we clinged hard to peer review as something seemingly very important, but back in 1991, arXiv showed that it may not have quite as much importance as we think. And as Noah said, and Michael Nielsen emphasized, in most scientific journals, peer review wasn't routine until the middle of the 20th century. And Aileen Fife, who's at the same institution as Noah, has done a lot of work on the history of peer review, and she said that we shouldn't treat it as a sacred cow, but rather just as the currently dominant practice in a long and varied history of reviewing practices. So, do we really need to cling so hard onto peer review? Back in 1998, Tony Delamoth, the then deputy editor of the British Medical Journal, asked what should the BMJ do about electronic preprints? And he highlighted that there are concerns about people having access to basically garbage information on the internet, and journalists and the public being misled. Particularly this is a concern in the biomedical sphere. But he also noted that if they find that they're useful, researchers will use electronic preprints just because of their benefits. So if, as someone said in an earlier session, if things are useful, researchers will use them, will adopt them. And then in 1999, Harold Varmus at the National Institutes of Health put out his eBiomed proposal, and this really helped to unleash a lot of ideas. Essentially, the proposal was to put out papers as unrefereed preprints and then for peer review to happen later on. It unleashed a lot of ideas and it unleashed a lot of attacks from the publishing community, and it didn't quite happen in the way originally envisaged. Some publishers supported it. The Lancet said that the proposal had given publishing a welcome jolt. But there were real worries, I think, particularly about the changes in peer review that it proposed, and it just seemed to be ahead of its time for biomedicine at any rate. About that time, somebody asked me about the future of publishing. I found this email yesterday when I was hunting through for inspiration for today, and what I said was, I predicted that the uproar caused by eBiomed and along with increasing IT familiarity by researchers would finally, in 10 years' time, get people thinking seriously about how to improve peer review. Because back in 1999, people were just afraid to touch peer review. They didn't want it to change. And so I was more or less right, actually. 2010, okay, so PLOS One came along in 2006. And I think really you can say that that 1999 proposal, it led to PubMed Central and the growth of open access publishing, and indirectly it led to PLOS One, which introduced a different kind of peer review. It's the is it good science peer review as opposed to is it exciting and the first of its kind. So that really did lead to an innovation in peer review. And now we've got crazy wild people like John Tennant saying, can you peer review the arXiv? On that note, I think I'll pass over to Ed.
Right. I don't have any slides, but I have lots to say. So my background is in physics. We've had the arXiv for the longest time. I'm always perplexed at the response to the idea of preprint servers and their potential use in the life sciences and in chemistry. And the objections just I find very perplexing. What I'm most perplexed by is the resistance from researchers themselves. So this is something that I've been sort of exploring for many years. I'm also interested in the role of publishers and the role of traditional journals in a world where preprints are the norm. Although I know many publishers are concerned about preprints, from my own experience, I don't think there's any reason to be. Nature Physics, one of the journals that I worked for previously, had no problems in having people subscribe to the journal. It didn't cause any problems, even though it came along a full 15 years, 14 years after the arXiv, and Nature has long since allowed researchers to publish on the arXiv before submitting their papers to us. One of the things that really struck me while I was at Nature Physics, one of the fields that I was responsible for was graphene research. And graphene research predominantly gets published on the arXiv first because of the issue of priority. It's such a fast-moving field, and everyone in the field wants to make sure that they get credit for the first to be, if they've got their results, they want to get credit for being the first to publish those results. And the beauty is that the physics community recognize the arXiv as the place that gives priority. At the same time, they also say they also feel that the established journals like Nature Physics, like Nature, like Physical Review Letters, and many others are the place that apply validity to these results. So the journals and the preprints do different things in the peer review. In the conferring value to papers. What I found was astonishing with graphene was I would go to referees and say, I've got this paper has been submitted, I think it's very interesting, I'd like to hear your comments, will you review it? And very often they would say, yes, I'd be glad to review it, I've already read it. I've already read it on the arXiv, I already have an opinion on it. And so they were ready, in a sense, the paper had already been peer reviewed before I'd sent it out to peer review. And I think that's really interesting in that. And also part of the dissemination aspect had already happened at that stage. I was concerned for my future at that stage, so thinking, well, eventually preprints are going to do away with my point. If that happened, that's fine. I don't want to do a job that actually has no value. I think I do a job that has value, but if preprints did wipe away publishers, well, so be it in the future. And then there were many other instances. Most recently, I think, in the physics context, was faster than light neutrinos. This was a result collected by the Opera consortium underneath Gran Sasso. They'd found a signal that suggested that neutrinos generated at CERN and detected in Gran Sasso were traveling at faster than the speed of light. And they'd checked and checked and checked. And the signal was still there. And they didn't have an explanation for what this meant. But if it were true, it would be an absolute massive revolution in science. It would have been great for science because it would have just given physicists so much more to do to explain this result. Anyway, rather than being kept secret and then submitted to a journal, not telling anyone about it except the journal editors and peer reviewers, they put it on the arXiv. And what I thought was interesting about that was many people were scandalized. How dare anyone... Well, they weren't scandalized by it being put on the arXiv, they were scandalized by the fact that they then started talking to journalists about it. And they were scandalized by saying, don't talk to the public about this new result because we don't know what it means yet. And it's too dangerous for the public to find out that there is some questioning of the fundamentals of physics. I mean, we could tell them about it once we know what it means, but we can't tell them about it now. And then you saw lots of people writing analyses and theories, and it led to a whole slew of other papers on the arXiv. It led to many things being written about it in the New York Times, on the BBC. You had these physicists disagreeing with these physicists, and it was all being done in public. It was peer review being done in public. And I thought that's extraordinary. A lot of people were concerned, you know, if people see peer review going on in public, then they won't believe science anymore. I take the opposite view, is that I think they will continue to believe science. They will understand what science is. They will have a more realistic view of what science is. And I don't think they should believe that science is this thing that is perfect and wholly formed and never open to debate. So I think preprints are a really interesting mode in which these public discussions can have in the context of the traditional scientific paper.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, so I have a question. So this is my question is, or rather my statement is, my hypothesis is, it's dangerous for the public to see scientists arguing in public.
So do you want to vote on that with your accept?
You're all going to say no, I'm sure.
Is it dangerous?
Is it dangerous? Or the statement, it's dangerous for the public to see scientists arguing in the paper.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So we reject that. That's
what
good.
about what about in the context of climate change?
Oh. Any different for climate change? Oh, one.
See, it changes that. Or evolution.
Still mostly reject.
In the context of evolution?
So they're sticking firm to rejecting on balance.
Right, okay. But it was interesting that it changed when it came to climate change.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So on to Kat.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Kat. They tell me the clicky thing will work from here. There we go. I just wanted to talk a little bit today about the engagement that goes on around existing preprint servers and what implications that has for researchers. So I think we're all pretty much agreed the power of repositories such as arXiv is that they are so open, which of course has a huge effect on how the research that is published there is consumed and commented on. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the engagement data that we've tracked at altmetrics, where I work, for the papers that have been published on arXiv. So I think it's really interesting here. If you look at, for example, papers published in Nature, you'll see a huge amount of news attention, which is the red colour. Whereas in this graph, you can see it's a much broader audience engaging. So there's a lot of light blue, which is Twitter, and it's because communities of all different types are coming together to discuss this paper, which is really interesting when it hasn't yet been validated by experts, potentially. This is for bioarchive content, so even with a relatively new preprint server, there's already a lot of engagement going on around it. So research made openly available is subject to peer review from all angles, not just from experts. And what does that mean for researchers? What implications does it have for their careers and for how they grow their reputations? Being open, as we've mentioned, gives a much broader audience a chance to engage with the work. And that is also reflected in the top 100 list that we at altmetrics create every year. So in the 2015 list, 42% of the research that made up the list of the most popular articles that had had the most attention that year, so 42% were published open access, which just shows how much more accessible research that is made openly available really is. And also interestingly, in that list, 5 articles actually came from arXiv itself. So that's really changed how this research has been communicated and how visible it has been made. If we think about who is engaging with this research, being so open means that not only are researchers and other audiences given much more access to the research, but also to each other. They're more connected than they ever were before. The moment something goes online, people across the world can discuss it with each other and debate its arguments in real time. So let's take this article published just 2 days ago on bioarchive. Already, if we look at the altmetrics Twitter data for it, it's had tweets from over 20 users. And I think what's really interesting here is that it's actually the researchers themselves who are actively going onto Twitter and seeking feedback on their work, which is a really different approach to what might have happened, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So the way that experts and non-experts find and consume academic content has been completely transformed by the availability of preprints. Points of view and conflicting statements can be exchanged instantaneously. As soon as something is made available online, there's no waiting to send a letter to a journal or even having your comment published on the journal website. And no one is checking the credentials of the people who are commenting, but it's all public for anyone to see. So anyone can watch the conversations play out in real time, which exposes researchers to potentially much higher and more stressful levels of critique than ever before. So these are some of the key things that I think we should think about when we think about the role of preprints in scientific publication. So with no publisher to act as mediator, researchers find themselves much more connected but much more exposed. And there are both advantages and disadvantages to this. And I just had a couple of points that I wanted you as an audience to consider. Maybe you could use your paddles to vote. So how many people in the room would say that open is always a positive thing?
Yeah, oh, a couple of rejects, and yes, there's a bit of yellow and
Yeah, quite a
other
mixture.
colours, but largely accept, I think. Maybe 2/3 to 3/4 accept.
Okay, and another one. Should researchers be able to prepare responses to comments made before they're public? So what I really mean here is comments from experts. Should researchers be given a chance to prepare a response before the comment is made available online so that they can, defend themselves? What would people say to that? Mostly accept, a few
mostly
rejects.
accept, but there's a few reds and yellows as well. Yeah, so
Okay.
not unanimous, but majority accept.
And then the last one, which we've already heard quite a lot about today, in a positive way, would we all agree that anonymous peer review of preprints in particular should be allowed? Bit of a mixture again.
Yes, a mixture. I'd say majority is accept, but there's certainly quite a bit of dissent from that. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Kat. And on to Tiago.
Hi, everyone. So, as a former scientist who was in the lab until last year, when I joined F1000, one of the first things I did was to try to understand the landscape of publishing and particularly what F1000 research is doing from a data perspective. And I think this was relevant in the sense, in the preprint topic, in the sense that, if we were to have open peer review for preprints or in a more generalized way, does open peer review really work? And for example, at F1000 research, the reports are published immediately as we receive them from the referees. So you can imagine a situation where the second referee actually has access to the report of the first one before it makes their decision. So I looked into that and I thought, okay, so is it true that the second referee is just really following what the first one did? And the fact is that, and this is what made me very hopeful, is that actually we don't see any evidence of that. So it's not like the second referee is just following suit of what the first one did. And I thought that was something that made me very hopeful of the process. And also, in a way, of some of what people criticize open peer review for may actually not be that relevant. So, in the other aspect was that one concern that I had was that in the preprint world, whether we could rely on crowdsourcing comments to substitute in some way formal peer review. And unfortunately, I think the experience that we see from bioarchives and also arXiv is that it's actually a very small number of publications in preprints that get substantial number of comments and substantial feedback. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think a model in which you can combine the clear benefits of preprints in terms of setting a priority, of being rapid publication, that has to be combined with more of a traditional, or not necessarily a traditional, but a formal form of peer review in which there is someone who's really driving the process. I think in order for us to ensure that the majority of the content that is published has some sort of eyes look into it, I think there has to be someone who really looks into the process, and I think that is, in a way, the role that the publishers can have in the preprint world, just to enforce it, to make sure that peer review happens. And the other concern that I hear recently is because if we let everyone publish rapidly, and if we have this vast number of publications that we now have, how can the readers know what they should read? And I think that is true that some people would say that with the traditional system, you can look at journals and see that these are the journals that have a high reputation, so these are the articles I should be reading, which we all would agree that's not a very good way of doing it. But what was interesting to see at F1000 was that Prime, our literature recommendation service, without even we prompting our experts to look into preprints, they naturally follow that. So it was really interesting to see that even if we haven't said to our experts, could you have a look at preprints, see what's there that is worth recommending, they naturally did that. So I think this is, again, another positive aspect that preprints are really in the eyes of people, and we're getting they're starting to get the credit that they deserve. And finally, in terms of the peer review process and the what can we do, what should we do to 2030, I think that peer review has to change in two different ways. I think, and I'll separate them in terms of technology and culture. I think culturally, I'm a strong believer on open peer review, and coming back to the question that was asked this morning of what open peer review actually means, and I mean in the sense of the reports being made public and being signed by the peer review. So I think there's something that needs to change in the culture of the scientific community for so that the peer reviewers are credited for the work they are doing, and also to in a way that we don't necessarily see those comments as being a final decision, but it's more of a discussion that peer reviewers have with authors that hopefully contribute to the quality of the publication. And then in terms of technology, I think this is something that probably is being discussed in the other room at this time. I think the way that peer review is done, I think, is quite primitive. We see so much change in technology in the whole in science, and yet we still have peer review being done by a referee emailing a doc file to an editor, and I think that is really so old-fashioned that it's not really keeping up with the times. Coming to those discussions, and if you could give me your views. So would we think that by 2030 all the peer review will be open? Will we have all the referees signing their name when they write the report?
Okay, hold up your paddles.
Ooh.
Largely reject, a few accepts, but
right.
Yeah, majority say no.
Right. So, but would you agree that it is quite unrealistic to be able to recognize the work that the peer reviewers do if we don't disclose what it is, what their reports were and how they contributed to it?
So recognition requires openness of
yeah.
reviews. Slight majority for accept, I think.
Interesting.
But it's quite mixed, and some revisions suggested.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. On to Mimi. Fine.
Hi everyone. So my name is Mimi. I work on implementations for Figshare. Figshare is an open data repository, and we treat data as a first-class research object. Before Figshare, I was a researcher. I actually worked on graphene, but for an industrial lab, which has since closed down. So I'm pretty sure everything I created is in a bin somewhere. Okay. So this session is about looking at the impact of preprints on peer review. I think there are benefits to peer review. They've been mentioned. It acts as a quality assurance filter. It helps good science get through. One of the problems is qualifying what good is. It's not always objective. Peer review is, at the moment, done by humans at least. And humans have vices like egos and laziness and jealousy. I'm not saying this is widespread, but it does happen. And I think everyone in the room probably knows someone with a peer review horror story somewhere. So also reviews are happening on a per journal basis right now, which means, to a certain extent, the journal's brand and the range of topics within an issue come into play and mean that good science can just be overlooked. Preprints overcome these. So preprints bring the attention back onto the work itself. They allow for an open discussion of the results while it's happening, which is important. Misconceptions about peer reviews that I think are misconceptions, that they sneak in pseudoscience through a back door. Somehow the comments on them are less valuable because these people haven't been vetted in the same way that a traditional reviewer would be. And as I've asked, does this matter? If everything is open, can we leave it up to communities and the field itself to sort the wheat from the chaff? And there's an example of this in action. So recently, I'm trying to remember when, but I can't, there was a declaration signed by the Wellcome Trust and the Melinda Gates Foundation, a couple of other big players in the funding and publishing space, that any research output related to the Zika virus had to be made available. And it had to be made available as soon as possible. And they used preprint servers to disseminate this information, both positive and negative. So we've said that in a public health crisis, we want progress to happen quickly, and the way we do that is by making information available as quickly as possible. So if we already know how to do, well, this is the most effective way to do science, then why are we wasting time doing it any other way? Why are we wasting people's careers doing it any other way? And there is a simple answer, which is unfortunately your CVs. Preprint citations are not recognized right now. They are not seen in the Thomson Reuters citation index. They are not considered by the REF, which is the framework by which universities are judged by their research outputs. And this is because they're still kind of viewed as drafts rather than ongoing conversations about a piece of work. And I would argue they still only tell half the story. If you don't make your data available with the claims that you're making, then how can it be critiqued properly? Now, I'm obviously biased because I work for an open data repository, but you don't have to make your data openly available to make it available. Lots of repositories allow you to create metadata-only records, or a framework through which you can reserve a DOI, cite that in your manuscript, even in a preprint or beyond, and get a private link which can be shared with reviewers of your choice, at request. I think, and so this is kind of the question back to you guys, that data citations are going to overtake paper citations, because data can be used at all stages, in the preprint and the postprint stage. And so actually that's the one thing I want to ask you. Do you think by 2030 we won't be talking about citations about papers anymore? We'll be talking about data citations?
Okay. Yes, again, quite mixed. Mostly minor revisions and some major revisions, and some except. Yeah, so I think revisions necessary.
Revisions necessary. That's okay. I want to hear the answer, actually. Okay. But I think there's going to be a change in the way we value research. It's going to be about the whole story and the entire picture, not just the preprint, not just the publication. And I'm interested to hear everyone else's thoughts on what they think on this.
Thank you. So, questions from the audience. Does anybody want to ask anything? John.
I'm going to ask a bit of a snarky question for a change. So this is for the chap from Nature. Sorry, I forgot your name. So you just gave a really nice, passionate talk about why you think preprints are so important. If that was true, then why the hell does Nature have a 6-month embargo on preprints?
That's fine. That is to the final view. That's to extract or rather realize some saleable value from the value that we put into peer review.
Surely you run so much value to the process that you don't need an embargo.
But how would we? Why would anyone buy a subscription to Nature? If well, that's okay. No. Why would anyone buy a subscription to Nature if they could get it all for free, like totally? And that's yeah. Well, they wouldn't.
I'll go for free.
Yeah. No, and then Nature wouldn't exist, and then Nature wouldn't do the thing that Nature does.
Okay.
And if that's sure.
So there is an uneasy tension between these.
No, there is.
Publishing realities and the desires for complete openness and early access.
Sure.
Another question here.
Because Nature doesn't have a 6-month embargo on preprints. It's on the author's accepted manuscript. So the preprint itself can be available as soon as possible,
actually,
while the manuscript's under review.
Okay, thank you. Another question down the front, David.
I'm actually perfectly serious. I mean, I don't see that Nature adds any value to it. Anything can be published now. There's a zillion and one journals writing to you every day, and it charges an enormous amount and it distorts science because it allows stupid elderly academics to count papers in it as though that meant anything. It just means it's more likely to be retracted, probably, as we know. I really can't see that Nature is. I think it should be a nice news magazine, but it shouldn't publish original work. It's just awful.
Well, I guess if academics still want to publish in Nature and are supporting it, then you can't blame Nature for continuing to exist.
But
it's the academic behaviour.
But not for the value that is added to the publication, but because of the reward that comes to publishing with Nature.
If we change the way in which academics are judged and valued, maybe we will see a change in the way that they treat these hyper-impact factor journals.
There's a question from Anna.
Anna Sharman, co-factor. This takes me straight on to the biggest question, which seems to be being asked here. The onus seems to be on institutions and funders. Are any of them here, apart from Wellcome, which is obviously leading the way on this? How can we persuade the universities, the hiring committees, the funding review, grant reviewers, how can we persuade them to allow preprints and not to take any notice of journal names?
Well, preprints, I can say that is starting to change. Rockefeller University will accept preprints on people's CVs. The Wellcome are currently planning to put something out, I think later this month, to allow preprints. NIH is consulting on that. So, and also EMBO for their fellowships, applications for EMBO fellowships can include preprints. So it is starting to change, and I think once Wellcome have put theirs out, that will probably start to shame some other funders and institutions into following suit.
Yeah, I think altmetrics are absolutely the way forward, 100%. Just a question, really. Just as it's very, very frowned upon for research groups to be citing their own research papers to bulk up their H-index in that manner, because I think that altmetrics is the way forward. Is there are there any steps that are being taken to make sure that people aren't just retweeting their own work or retweeting their own group's work, and whether or not there's a way of being able to judge that to make it look clear?
I think the thing that we would say in response to that is the whole point of altmetrics is that they're really transparent, and that it's not just about how high your score is and therefore how much attention you've got, but actually about where the attention is coming from and why people are talking about your work. So certainly in everything that we produce, we put a huge focus on making all of the original mentions available so that you can actually go in and judge for yourself why something is receiving a lot of attention. And to speak to the example you gave, I think we would want to actively encourage authors to go out and promote their work and make it more visible if it can be of benefit to a wider audience. And it would be through making the data transparent that, you'd be able to see that author had tweeted their own work 10 times. And then it's up to the reader to make their own conclusions about that.
Altmetrics is the way forward. It's a stupid and corrupting influence which takes money from universities. It publicises usually the most gimmicky and poor work. I've got several examples on my blog. I'd be happy to give you the links afterwards. Okay. I mean, it really is not the way forward for anything. It's just a bit of profit-making gimmickry, which does nothing.
You should stick with impact.
Science. Most people, most scientists don't take any notice of it. I know UCL pays for it, and if you go onto your own page, you can see it. But who the hell cares?
Okay, at the back, Carver, thank you.
Just competing to be the most miserable git here. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way.
You did.
Or negative, rather. I think, firstly, can I just ask that we don't talk about 2030, we talk about 2020. I just can't wait for 2030. Any change for 2030, I'm not interested. We should move faster. I'd like to echo the sentiment that we've got the funders and institutions should stop counting, having the only currency of recognition being the number of papers and the impact factor of that journal which you happen to publish in. Let's get beyond that. I'd like to go further, be a bit more miserable here, and really go beyond preprints. Again, the name depresses me. It's preprint, which assumes there's a print. We don't have print anymore. So the preprint itself assumes that you have a paper or a PDF coming later, and we are being really clever. We're putting a PDF starting in that. We really should go beyond that, and I'd say some sort of, rather than wait for a print to come out, we should have a system where we can release the tiny whatever we found in the lab, and let's collaborate on that.
That's good. But that's good. My concern. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
But I speak to hundreds of scientists every week, and one of my jobs. So I'm actually based in China, and one of my goals is to try and convince Chinese researchers of the benefits of opening up their data. Firstly, the benefits of open access, but now increasingly they understand that, are convinced by that. Opening up their data, trying to convince them that they'll get more citations, they'll get more collaborations, which then means more citations. Certainly in China, and I think elsewhere in the world, there is a real reluctance, or rather a fear, that if they start opening up their data gets stolen. And I think preprints are a way of, as I've said, it's a way of establishing priority. Let's call them, or pre-publions maybe. We've got to find ways of recognizing and overcoming that fear. Overcoming fear is the hardest thing to do, and it takes a really long time.
Let's try.
No, absolutely.
China is sort of the other end of the spectrum, where people get they get paid $30,000 cash.
That doesn't happen anymore.
If they happen to. If they publish in
Nature,
you know, when they see
really
that.
Happen anymore. It still happens in Germany, by the way. So it's not just China. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And the other thing is that we're talking to policymakers and funders to try. That's the way we're going to move the dial. If we can we need to convince the researchers. But if we can get them some of the way, and then ask the policymakers and the funders to push them the rest of the way, that's how we're going to make progress. But I think the biggest problem is fear, and fear is difficult to move. It's certainly difficult to move quickly.
Okay, so the original, are we sticking to the original schedule? Okay, right, so another 5 minutes. Any other questions from the audience? Or do you want to do some more paddle voting? Oh, okay.
Hi, I work in communications for Biomed Central, as some of you are probably aware, and deal with journalists every day, and trying to stop them taking science out of context, trying to get them to report on science fairly so as not to terrify the general population. Can the panel maybe speak a little bit about how we might prevent that if we were to move to everything being published in preprints?
Is Ava Amson here? She's not, because we're talking about this very thing with Ava over lunch. I think we concluded that no one quite knows what to do about this yet, because if the preprint is out there, anybody can see it and pick it up. I know bioRxiv tweet their preprints, so journalists can potentially pick it up. On the other hand, if it's not yet peer-reviewed, press officers and researchers are reluctant to prepare press releases until they know that it's past the peer review. So there's kind of an unhappy, unstable mixture of circumstances there. Do you have any thoughts on?
I don't think that preprints are the culprit of pseudoscience being out there. I think pseudoscience being published in different outlets was there a long time ago. So I don't think the preprints are necessarily really adding to that problem. I think, if anything, I would see that as a motivation to educate the readers about science. And I think they take that as an opportunity for people to be more critical of what they read. You could actually, so one of the reasons that we have an embargo is to give journalists the time to prepare a well-researched, thoughtful story without fear of being scooped before the date of publication. You could argue, and I don't know whether this is actually happening or will happen, that preprints give people even longer lead time. If we could convince journalists not to
make bold statements on the basis of preprints until a paper is published. They can at least be aware that the preprint is out there, aware that this story is brewing, and get ready for when the paper gets published. That creates a great lead time. Whether that's going to happen, I'm not so sure. I suspect that the desire to scoop would actually short-circuit that. So that is, I think that is a concern. The answer is hopefully to encourage better journalism.
David?
The reason for hyped up newspaper articles is not largely journalists. It's the university press releases and it's the journal press releases. There's the most disgraceful case just recently of Science tweeting a thing about, magnetic stimulation improves your memory. It's got memory and it's going to get lots of retweets. Altmetrics is that naive.
Okay.
And I looked at the paper just out of interest, and the paper was mostly about fMRI. Well, we know that that's mostly not believable either now, but never mind that. The actual allusion to memory was one part of one figure. My diagnosis was they'd been told that you can't publish an fMRI only thing anymore, so you've got to have some functional stuff. Mm-hmm. And they tagged this on. And it was a before and after, not a proper parallel study. And it had p equals 0.043, which gives it at least a 50% chance of being wrong. I mean, it was the most naive stuff. That was the journal, though, that was at fault then.
Well, yeah,
you can't expect journalists to have the detailed knowledge to prevent them from being deceived by the journals and the authors themselves via university press releases. It's well documented now that the
I don't think that's necessarily universally true. Most of the, I mean, I've noticed, I've seen universities put out press releases on papers that I've published that I've been furious about because I've read this and I thought that's just not true. I'm not sure what I get to do in that situation. But I don't think it's all one person's fault or all other persons. It's not all the journalist's fault. It's not all the university's fault. It's not all journalists' fault. No. I think there is collective responsibility.
The last time we had an article in Nature, we had to actually stop University College putting out a press release about it because they put some art graduate onto it who was incapable of writing anything honest, apparently.
Sure.
Well, so I think it is a collective responsibility. It's because we're trying to sensationalize science and keep the public out of it, which I think you highlighted in your talk, that it's not a bad thing if the public understand how science is actually done. That it's a debate, and you put forward an argument with your evidence, and if you're showing that your conclusions are not as sound as they should be, someone else trumps it with theirs. And this idea that it's complete because I've published it needs to change rather than anything else.
Okay, so I think we're coming to the end of our time. So preprints are out there. Preprints are becoming more widely used, more widely available. What I want to ask you in your final vote, coming to 2030, so 14 years' time, do you think that preprints will make peer review unnecessary? Will we get to the point where we don't need peer review? Oh, a firm, one yes down here, but otherwise a pretty firm reject.
That's the big except down there, which is a surprise, I think.
That's the first time we voted, I think, so it counts treble. Okay, how about the slightly weaker version? That in 2030, the availability of preprints, the use of preprints, will make peer review less prevalent. There'll be a smaller proportion of the literature is peer-reviewed. That's got a few more, maybe, but still a predominantly reject, but maybe a third to 2/5 accept. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention and your voting, and enjoy your coffee break now.